So you get into your gasoline or petrol powered car and it just won't start in the morning. Where do you begin? How do you diagnose a non-start problem on your gasoline engine? Well, this video is going to take step-by-step approach to diagnosing the problem. And even if it's not a problem that affects you now, it'll certainly be worth watching this video in its entirety just to get in mind the various issues that could arise. So if you ever are hit with this problem, you can get to the root cause as quickly as possible. So the most common cause for non-starting engines is a flat battery. So you may get a little bit of juice in the battery. It might even be enough to turn the starter motor, but not quite enough to maintain the engine's required cranking speed to start off the engine itself. The starter motor may just rotate slightly and then die out. So if you've got a voltmeter, you can measure the voltage across the battery when the starter motor is engaged. And ideally it should be around 12.6 to 13.5 volts. If it's lower than that, that is probably your problem, a flat battery. So getting another battery and doing a jump, connecting them together and just using the extra juice from the other battery, if the car starts, then it was a battery problem. So charge the battery. It may have just got a bit flat. You tend to find that happens over winter where you're taking a lot of juice out of the battery. But batteries do degrade over time. The voltage they can produce substantially reduces as they start to degrade and age. And most modern batteries are maintenance free, but some of the old batteries required topping up and checking the levels in those. So if that applies to you, certainly check that. But in most cases, going out and getting a new battery is the answer. And we're going to do a video on battery technology because it's come on leaps and bounds. There's so much on offer now when it comes to car batteries that just wasn't available 30, 40 years ago when we first started driving cars. So the next most common issue is just the starter motor, so a bad starter. So when you turn the key in ignition, first of all, the starter motor is kicked into the teeth so it can engage with the engine itself and start to rotate the engine. So that little solenoid can seize up. You can have a problem where the starter motor is clicking, but it's just not clicking into place. It's not enough power in that solenoid. Now I had that on a car and I solved the problem just by hitting the starter motor as I turned the key in the ignition. Obviously I didn't do that myself, it required two people. But just giving the starter motor a little jolt sometimes is enough to free up that starter motor. And if you've not used the car for a while, that could potentially be the problem. The starter mechanism has just seized. So failing that, if it's kicking in okay, it may just be a degraded starter motor. So it's essentially a motor which will wear out over time. The little brushes inside the electric motor themselves can often wear. We had a place locally that used to take your old starter motor and recondition it. But nowadays we seem to be in a throwaway society where you just discard the old starter motor and go out and get a new one, so that's a bit more expensive. It's always worth checking that you're getting voltage at the starter motor at that point. So you could have a perfectly good starter motor, but if a fuse is blown or there's a problem with the circuit delivering power to the starter motor, that can obviously prevent the starter motor from doing its thing, and going out and replacing the starter motor won't fix the problem because it's located elsewhere in the electrical system. So the next essentials that you need to look at when you look to starting problems on a gasoline engine, it needs fuel, it needs air, and it needs a spark. So air is generally not a problem. The engine will suck. So the engine itself is an air pump essentially, so the engine itself will suck in air. So unless that engine is seized, you should be able to get air into the engine. Even if you've got a bad turbocharger, you will get some air into the engine. So it's just important to check for spark and for fuel. So we'll just address the spark side of it. So you've got your spark plugs, you've got a coil that ups the voltage from the battery so it's able to jump the gap on the spark and create the spark. So there's quite a few components there that can go wrong. Some cars have individual spark coils on each spark plug. Some have just one coil located in the ignition system, but the coils themselves can degrade and can break and prevent that voltage from being stepped up and getting to the spark plug altogether. The spark plugs themselves can become degraded over time. The electrodes can break off. They can just become so soiled up that they're effectively insulated and they just will not carry a spark. So you will generally notice your starting problems getting worse over time if it's the plugs starting to foul up. And cleaning the plugs is usually enough to solve that problem, but you've got to ask the question, why were the plugs starting to soil up? So just removing those spark plugs and inspecting them will tell you quite a bit about the condition of the engine, and you can see where the electric is tracking across the spark plug and it's not actually jumping over the gap that you want it to. So the fuel pump obviously supplies the fuel to the fuel system, it pressurizes the fuel system, then you've got the fuel pressure regulator and the fuel return line. So if that fuel pump is broken, if it's not maintaining sufficiently high pressure, you will see a starvation of fuel at the engine, and if you haven't got any fuel, you just will not get the engine to start. So typically the engine will turn over, you'll hear it sparking, it will be trying to do something, it just won't be able to initiate the engine ticking over. So again, check for voltage at the fuel pump. Just make sure it's getting voltage, that you're not dealing with a broken fuse or some other issue in the fuel system. The fuel filter is another common component that clogs up. So if that fuel filter is blocked, the fuel just won't be able to flow through, or the flow rate will be so sufficiently reduced you just won't get enough fuel to support the engine when it's running. Now that again tends to happen over time. If you've got old fuel, that can tend to form wax, and that is quite notorious for blocking your fuel filter. But if you've not changed your fuel filter for some time, that could well be the issue, and it's a fairly simple cheap fix just to change the fuel filter. In most cars they're readily, easily accessible and quite a quick job to change yourself. In some it's a bit of a pig, so hats off to those engineers that made such a simple task really complex. While we're talking about fuel, stupid thing, but I think we've all been caught out by this, I know I have, low fuel. So if you're out of fuel, you obviously are never going to get the car started. So if the needle is way down on the tank, you could well be having a problem where the tank is maybe on a slope and the pickup just can't get the fuel. Or it may just be a faulty sender that's telling you there's fuel in the tank when actually there isn't. So make sure you have got fuel in the tank before you do any of these diagnostics, because you will, like I did, feel pretty silly that it was such a simple fundamental problem. And ironically, I got home and it just wouldn't start the following morning, so I actually run out of fuel on my drive at home. So there's other mechanical problems that affect the engine. The ECU controls the firing of the engine, it relies on lots of sensor feedback, and if there's something seriously wrong with the engine, that may well refuse to start. So your timing chain controls the cam and essentially fixes the cam speed in relation to the rotations of the crank. So if that timing chain or belt has stretched or slipped, or the tensioner is faulty, the ECU might be getting confused that the cam is at the wrong position for the crank position, and it just starts to throw a hissy fit and just cuts out, refuses to start. You will generally get poor running and other issues, so it's technically not usually a cause of a non-start. You normally have problems with that long before you get a non-starting issue. So other mechanical things that can go wrong in the engine: if the head gasket has gone, if it's leaking coolant, if the engine has seized up, if the lubrication has not worked, the engine's got too hot, the pistons or other components within the engine could just effectively be locked into place, and there's no way that engine is going to rotate. So that's quite an expensive repair. It nearly always necessitates a complete strip down and rebuild of the engine. So most modern cars are actually fitted with some kind of immobilizer, and typically that is disabled with some sort of transmitter that you have in the key fob. If the battery is getting low on power, it can actually prevent the car from starting because the immobilizer is on all the time. So if you've got a spare key, just try that key and see if that starts the engine, and if it does, it could just be a simple matter of changing the battery in your key fob in order to disable the immobilizer on the car. So if that immobilizer itself is on, there's no way you're going to start it. The whole point of that is to prevent the car from starting unless you're using the correct key and immobilizer code. You'll often be able to pull off error codes from the ECU in non-start conditions, so it's a good place to start diagnosing just to see if it's reporting any problems, and that can give you an idea where you should start looking to diagnose the fault that's happening and preventing your engine from starting. So hopefully now, if you ever get a non-start problem, you can diagnose it like a boss and get straight to the root cause as quickly as possible and impress all those others in your car that are waiting for you to take them somewhere interesting. So thanks for watching. Please boot that like button because that really helps us to get out there, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so because we'd love you to stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.